Thank you everybody for coming. I'm Tim Carney. I am a senior fellow at AEI while being a senior columnist at the Washington Examiner. So that's the two institutions hosting us. So I don't have to thank either AEI or the Examiner because I am both of them. I do want to thank you for coming and thank our panelists for coming. It's because this is a small group of people who are very into this topic. What I want to do is really have a discussion about difficult questions. So we should talk and review about ways in which college campuses are too ideological, too intolerant, too woke, ways in which that has peaked or hasn't, but also talk about what proper steps to take are on the university, the state government, or any other level. And I think the three panelists we have here are a perfect way to start. Sam Abrams is my colleague here at AEI. He's a non-resident senior fellow, focuses on culture, ideology, academia, obviously, and he's a professor still of social science at Sarah Lawrence College, and he's affiliated with NYU as well. Inez Stepman is a senior policy analyst at Independent Women's Forum. She hosts a podcast, High Noon, on which I've been a guest, and she's a Lincoln Fellow with Claremont Institute and a senior contributor, so she's senior like me, to the Federalist. And Steve McGuire is the Paul and Karen Levy Fellow in Campus Freedom at the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. His academic work has focused on history of political thought and modernity and its critics, and obviously he's working on questions of campus toleration and that kind of thing. So I want to start with you, Steve.
Okay.
Has the sort of great awakening, has the intolerance on campus, et cetera, has it peaked? Is it getting worse?
Yeah, great question. I think there's some evidence that some of the fervor that we've seen in the last few years is peaking. Some of the excitement maybe is dying down a little bit. Actually, one recent possible example of this that I just saw concerns Abrams Kendi's center at Boston University, and he's laid off a bunch of people and restructured the center. And I saw that it looks like the amount of money that he's been raising for the center maybe has started to slow down. So that might be one sign that some of that excitement is dying down. Ross Douthat, of course, just had a column about this question about a week ago, and he cited some research that others have done that suggests that words that we would associate with the Great Awakening aren't showing up quite as frequently in research. There's some evidence that the number of cancellations that are taking place on campuses are dying down. So, but the data is fairly recent still. I mean, the Great Awakening, such as it is, isn't that old. So, if it is dying down, we're probably still in that process of it dying down. So it's hard, I think, to say for sure. And the other point that I'd like to talk about, is just how even if that excitement has died down, all the ways that it's embedded itself in our institutions, and we need to remain, very concerned about the wake of the Great Awakening.
Great, thank you. And Sam, you recently wrote a piece for the Examiner. I think it was part of our Restoring America project, which is behind this event, on that students aren't necessarily the problem. And it might not even be the professors, it's the administrators. Am I getting that right?
Yes. So I also want to say I am thrilled about what's happening with the Kendi Center at BU. One of the things putting my political science AEI hat on is that the left tends to eat itself for lunch. They can never be happy with anything. Someone always has to outflank the other person. And it is thrilling to watch this happen at BU, and it couldn't happen to a nicer person. Kendi is responsible for creating so much trouble. I see it on college campuses. I see it in my kids' schools. We are avowedly anti-racist. And I say, well, what does that mean? And they can't really explain it. And I say, so if I reject that, I'm a bad person. Yes. So, I'm very excited to see it topple. In terms of what's going on college and university campuses, lots of data keeps coming in, and it's been a lot of fun and crazy to work on. And, a couple of trends that are beginning to emerge. The first is that there are always going to be 15-20% of our students who are extremely progressive, extremely left. They're going to color their hair, wear Birkenstocks, the whole deal, and they're going to protest, and they're going to demand things. But if you look at the overwhelming majority, they're over this. They are running scared. They do not want to be canceled. They do not want to say the wrong thing. They actually want to ask questions. This is a significant improvement from what we saw 5 or 10 years ago when millennials were on campus. I cannot tell you how unpleasant it was to be on campus, and every time someone was called on, they couldn't just ask a question. It had to be an immediate invocation of their harms and their identity. As a person of this, this, and this, I feel this, or how do you justify that? That was a huge problem. And we've seen a very real shift. I've seen this having visited at least 200 schools in the last 5 years, with obviously a little interruption due to the lockdowns and pandemic. Academics, professors, having surveyed many of them and spoken with hundreds of them over the last decade or so, there are some that are pretty left of center, but for the most part, they don't want to deal with this. Most faculty members feel like they are overworked and underpaid, including myself. I'm really not that interested in staying late or making a stink about something. Yes, I might sign a petition here and there. I actually avoid doing that for the most part, but most faculty don't care. What's really been going on is this is the administrative class, and we hear stories about this all the time. Yale has a 1-to-1 ratio of basically every student has an administrator. Stanford looks very similar. We want to be careful with some of those numbers, of course, because it inflates them based on medical school and research. But nonetheless, the fact is it's an administrative problem. They are feeling the pain. They are furious at me because I called them out on this about 6 years ago. However, they are constantly looking for ways to grow. So one of the things in the Examiner piece that's worth mentioning is they know they're under attack, they know they're under scrutiny, and this is something they're seeing in Florida, North Carolina, Texas, and the like. But what they're beginning to do, and the thing that I want to mention here, which is very scary, is they're beginning to teach. These are not professors, these are not
The administrators are beginning to teach.
Yes, they are. These are not people who have been vetted or gone through an academic process. These are often master's degree holding folks. I know I'm being recorded, they're going to love hearing this, but many of them dropped out or didn't get into the PhD programs, and then that's fine. But they're not necessarily experts in their particular fields. They're activists, and what they're doing, and what's very scary in the headline is that they're teaching surface learning courses, and basically that means they're going to teach a course in politics or anthropology or sociology or something like that, and they're going to take the students into a jail or into a nonprofit, into a various center, and they're going to give a full course credit, full course load of credits for it. These are ideological moves, these are activist moves, and students are paying to take credits to be socialized, to become activists. We see this around the country. We see this at Sarah Lawrence. We see this all over the place. I think that there is incredible movement by folks here at AEI, by ACTA and others to push back some of this administrative creep. But the administrators are really trying to move the needle here, and they are searching for new ways to do it.
Thank you. Inez.
Yeah, maybe to tie in a few threads from what we've already heard, on the answer of has it peaked, maybe in sort of the vibe shift sort of way, and one sort of caveat on that would be to break out young men and young women, because they're going in radically different directions. But to me, the larger question is not just has it peaked, but has it been deinstitutionalized, and I think the answer to that is completely no. If you look at past advancements of the cultural left, there is usually a sort of backlash and plateau period where people are we're really tired about fighting about this, right? We're sick of the sort of the radicalism of the cultural left. And then what happens is, the Bill Ayers project, right? Those same people burrow into those institutions. They may not be quite as loud or obnoxious for a few years, but ultimately they still hold the power. And I think what we've seen is the transfer from the liberal left to the woke left in terms of institutionally, not just on campus, but then the PMC class that you've mentioned, they're not just administrators on campus, right? They are administrators in K-12 districts. They are in every HR department. These are the folks that the right told us for a long time with the blue hair and everything that they were going to hit and impact the real world, and they were going to abandon their radical politics. Well, instead, we all live on campus now. So that's the real question to me, is the institutionalization, although I will acknowledge there's been a certain amount of vibe cooling. And then finally, I think something I'm sure Tim will get into as a moderator, because he has contributed so much in this area. There's a question of genuine fragility and meaning that is being worked out for an entire generation and a half, at least, of Americans. A lot of the hysteria, as I'm sure you'll attest, is not fake. It's real. These are, young people who do not know how to live in a free speech society, don't have the kind of family structure, civic structure, religious structure, to be able to be anti-fragile enough to live in, I don't want to be dramatic, but to live in any kind of democracy. That's going to continue to be a problem, I think, despite this sort of cooling off.
So let me just ask you guys to follow up on that. I mean, so I'll start with you, Sam, because you're experiencing firsthand. You think that Gen Z, are they less fragile? Are they more tolerant? How go into the nuances of the differences that you're seeing?
So I wholeheartedly want to agree with what Inez has said. I think you're absolutely right. I think that a big narrative here, and I think we've all written about it, is there is been such an institutional decline that some of the resilience is gone. The ability to navigate complex issues is gone for many, many people. What I'm seeing on campus, however, is some signs of hope, where a lot of these students do want to confront difference. They do take pride in hearing alternative viewpoints. We see this all the time now in the FIRE work, in the Higher Education Research Institute studies. And these folks, have not had to go through sort of this cauldron of difference the way I think some of us have. I grew up very fortunately with a lot of institutions and took a lot of beatings, and that was a good thing. These folks have not. I would say that they may be more fragile than they should be, but the glimmer of hope that I'm seeing and feeling is that there is an openness to this in a way that I did not see 5 or 6 years ago with the older generation. So I'm concerned. I completely see your point and think there's incredible validity to it. I think we need to toughen these kids up, and I think they need some institutions and understandings that their norms and these institutions structure our lives. And
that would suggest to me that sometimes the mistake that conservatives make is to say, well, this is how we did it when I was that age, so we should do it that way. But if they're not getting the experience, the training in life, belonging to institutions, being exposed to other ideas, etc., that we got when we were kids, then they're going to need something else. They really are showing up on campus more fragile. Larry Arnn's idea at Hillsdale is put a small weight room in every dorm. And so when they're feeling stressed out, they have something to do besides complain to the dean. And so what any follow-up comments you have on anything said so far?
Well, it's interesting to hear Sam, put the blame primarily on the administrators. I think I'd certainly agree with that. And the point about them beginning to teach, I've seen things like that as well. In fact, I've heard, if you go to, say, like a Catholic liberal arts college, right, they say they focus on educating the whole person. And I've heard administrators say things like, well, faculty teach the students the technical information, they give them the expertise in the field, but it's really the people in student life who are, educating the whole person. They see themselves as the ones who are actually forming the students, and they are increasingly given opportunities to do this in classrooms, or there are these learning communities where there'll be an extra hour that's spent with an administrator, who is, teaching them about leadership or something like that. So that's certainly happening. But I wouldn't want to let the faculty and the students off the hook either. And it's probably fair to say that a lot of these things are due to a kind of tyranny of the minority, right? You've got this sort of far left, very vocal group among the faculty or among the students who are the ones that don't want somebody to speak or want to shout somebody down or don't want to discuss something in the classroom. And as mentioned, differences between men and women. I think we do, need to look at certain sort of demographic groups within the faculty and within the students, and we can see that there are differences in how they're responding to challenging ideas and that sort of thing. So I certainly think that's something that we need to take into account. But yeah, there's a large body of people who are probably more in the middle, and they will, in some instances, go one way or the other, right? So going back to this idea of the Great Awakening, what I think you saw on a lot of campuses back in 2020 is people sort of had a bit of a moral panic, or maybe more than a bit of one, and there were some people who started pushing certain ideas as a response to that, and then there was a whole other group of people who went along with that, and they maybe don't believe it quite as fervently, but they felt like, no, we need to do something. This seems like the kind of thing that a good person would do, and they went along with it. But now those are the people who are like, they're calming down, and you can see frustration on the left with this, right? So even not to keep picking on Kendi Center, but going back to that, you can see in some of the comments about that coming out of the left, right? They're talking about a racist backlash against anti-racism and DEI, and everybody's sort of losing faith or losing enthusiasm. So they're seeing it themselves. They just obviously have a very different, feeling about or reaction to that.
So I want us to start to make some distinctions here. Sometimes when people talk about, when you hear people on the left using terms that sound ridiculous to the normal ear, talking about microaggressions or this, sometimes they're actually talking about real things like manners, right? If somebody's constantly calling you by the wrong name, that guy's kind of a jerk or he's thoughtless, and they'll call it a microaggression. And when we talk about self-censoring, which is one of the big problems, sometimes self-censoring is just being polite, right? You're not gonna, we all probably follow a rule of you don't debate, you don't bring up abortion with a stranger on the metro, and you won't debate whether your religion is better than somebody else with them. And so to what extent is self-censoring just not talking about something irrelevant, not bringing up a controversial issue when it's just gonna upset somebody, or to what extent is it really stultifying on campus?
I mean, I would say that, people obviously do this kind of thing and sort of self-regulate, and that needs to be done in any human society.
That's part of college, is learning, okay, this is not the time to, or the place.
But what we've seen is, attention drawn to these things, hypervigilance, institutionalization of how to deal with these things, right? So now, if you said something that was a little bit offensive to somebody, they might call you out on it, or someone might pull you aside and say something afterwards, and you'd go apologize, and then you'd all, go have, dinner together or something. Now, somebody might anonymously report you to a bias response team. You'll get an automated email from some, software system that they have calling you into some office. And this becomes something that needs to be dealt with in an institutionalized way. And I think that the possibility of that happening, hearing stories about it having happened to other people, that can then feed back into these problems of self-censorship. I mean, people are going to say things that offend other people from time to time. It's always happened. We need to be able to deal with that in a way that doesn't involve punishing people.
I'm not sure that what we're seeing is so much an excess of politeness or civility, but a weaponization of people's instinct to be polite on behalf of ideological censorship. I was thinking about two stories as you guys were talking. One is my friend from college, and another is a student of a professor friend of mine now. The first is that this kind of ideological and how weaponized is exactly what you're talking about, the difference between being a jerk and a racist. This girl, her family's from Mexico. She's the first, first in her family to go to university, and studied engineering and had no, I would say, to my view, very few political opinions at all. Just not a political person, and so she finally, in the last year, after taking all of these engineering courses, had to take the required diversity requirement. Okay. And she came out of that course kind of shocked, and I remember her telling me, I used to think if someone didn't sit next to me on the bus, they were just like, they didn't like me for some reason, or if somebody was rude to me, like in the street, that they just, that these things happen to everyone. But now I realize it's because of the color of my skin. There is a danger in giving people an explanation for jerks. I think this very much happened very much during Me Too and all of that, right, where it was, every jerky behavior of a man became, borderline criminal. The other thing is, there's the second story that I was thinking about is of my professor friend's student. He's a grad student from Belarus. In terms of the politeness versus censorship distinction, I do think people are self-censoring in a much deeper way than out of an interest for harmony and civility. And the evidence I would give for that is exactly this Belarusian student's been here, 3-4 years in this program. And she said, when I first came to America, I thought, this is a free country as opposed to obviously Russian influence controlled Belarus. Particularly if anyone followed, there were, in 2021 and 2020, there were mass protests in Belarus, and people were getting thrown in jail and beaten with hoses and the typical things that happen in ex-Soviet controlled countries, right? Anyway, but she was talking recently with her professor and saying, well, I thought this was a different country, a free country, like very different than what I grew up in. And then I realized you just have a different system for enforcing the orthodoxy. And then she leaned forward and she looked behind her and she said, you have some pretty crazy views about sex. By which she meant not intercourse, but male and female, right? She had to look behind her. That's not civility. That's not smoothing things over with a friend. That is a privately implemented, but nevertheless very effective censorship regime.
And you were talking earlier about, another thing I think of is, dating and sex and all that stuff and the problems on campus. One of the things is that college and growing up is often about being pushed beyond your comfort zone and going through something awkward, right? Like if you were afraid of awkward situations, you would never be able to successfully date, right? Now awkward situations get described as harm.
Yes.
And this being uncomfortable is trauma, and that really gets in the way of growing up, I would imagine. But I want to talk about how to respond, because in Florida and Arizona, you have state governments taking action. As a conservative and somebody who loves academia while being spared getting even a master's, I care about academic freedom. And if you asked me in the abstract, should state legislators be actually regulating state universities, I'd say no, they should just hire a good dean, a good president, and then leave it up to them. But that's not the tack that Republican states are taking now. I want your guys' thoughts, if we just start with this question, state governments and state universities, what is the appropriate relationship? Has your thought on this changed in recent years? Sam, why don't you start?
I struggle with this all the time, because I could not agree more. In the abstract, this is a state good. Higher ed is a public good. It's funded by the state, and there's compelling interest by the state and the people to create, these sorts of institutions. It's a good thing to have academic freedom. You should appoint a chancellor, a president, a dean, what have you, to do this and to let that person manage these issues. The problem is that, as we all know in this room, that this stuff has gotten crazy, and the nonsense that we saw, for instance, in Florida at New College, what was very real and very, very dangerous. They were not promoting viewpoint diversity. It was becoming a leftist woke, and I don't like the term woke, but we'll use it here, monoculture, and it was not good for anybody. The question is, did Governor DeSantis in Florida probably go too far? And I think that they did.
If you were his advisor, what would you have told him to do or not do?
So, sure, one of the first things I would say is you need to put a non-political appointee in the president's office. And it needs to be someone who has the right values about what an institution such as the New College is. They could have put someone like me there. I don't think my family would be okay with moving down to Sarasota, although some of my family actually already lives in Sarasota. But, instead of overreaching in the other direction, which is what I think Florida has now done, unfortunately.
What specifically are overreaches, whether in Florida or other state? What are examples of what you think would be overreach?
Getting too involved in tenure decisions. That's just not what states should necessarily do. And again, I mean that in the abstract. And I understand where Florida's coming from. The new college was appointing ideological activists as professors, and it was pushing too hard. And that was harming, I believe, the state and harming what the state's general interest was. I don't disagree with them on that. But to then put in a new board, purely political, and then say no tenure, that becomes a little bit of a problem too, because it looks as extreme in one direction as what was already there. So no, it's putting in the academic, it's putting in the balanced academic who understands what academic freedom is, and says, look, we have to write this institution, and I don't mean write it ideologically, but write it, intellectually, and to do that, it's going to take some time. But I like what some of the other states are doing. In, say, North Carolina, where they're creating institutes. In Arizona, they're creating institutes, new schools to teach civility, new schools to teach viewpoint diversity. This is a way to do that without looking too draconian. That all being said, I do understand what Florida is doing and why they did it, but it does sort of step on my toes a little bit about how academic freedom should work. I'm hedging here, and I fully acknowledge that I'm hedging here. This is an issue that it's a real challenge, because I really do believe in academic freedom. But the question you wrestle with is, how do you push back on these state institutions when they are basically undermining the goals of the state and the needs of the state? And I don't have a great answer. As we talked about, we need to think of this whole thing as a big part, a large wave and where we are on that curve. And this will be one experiment of many to try to figure out what to do about it. But I would just hate to see certain parts of the country become as totalitarian on the right as it's been on the left. Then we're no better. So I struggle with that, and I apologize for hedging. A lot of folks would have said to me from various meetings, but just get rid of them all, fire everybody, and start over again. And I actually see that viewpoint, and I get it. But I guess the academic in me is just a little scared of that, and would like to try to do it in a more balanced way. And what I've said is, there have been multiple attempted cancellations of me, at least 3. I've had the DEI machine come after me. I've had biased reporting teams come after me. I've been accused of rape on a number of occasions. It's a lovely experience having that happen. And people say, why don't you resign? You work in a fairly hostile place in New York. And I said, because that's what they want. My simple presence on campus drives them crazy. They can't handle it. It feels like a high school clique. I walk by, if I see some professors, they turn away. And that's a lot of fun to watch. The faculty hate the fact that my classes are always oversubscribed. So to me, and students line up to take them, which is a lot of fun, and they discover I'm not very dangerous. I just have some different ideas that actually make a lot of sense if you do the reading. And the point of it is, put in folks like me to try to write these things, and believe me, the new college faculty will resign anyway. They don't want to deal with me. There are ways to do this without looking too extreme.
Yeah, tons to say. I mean, I think we are in a precarious moment, for our institutions of higher education. I mostly agree with what Sam has said. I mean, ideally, education is a public good. Our institutions should be above the partisan fray of our politics, right? You can't totally exempt them from politics, but they should generally be above that. But the institutions, if you look at the administrators, if you look at the faculty, if you look at the students, they all lean to the left. It's not surprising that people on the right, legislators in red states, have decided that they want to do something about this. And I agree with Sam. As an academic myself, I do have deep concerns about academic freedom. I've been following, for instance, some of the news about institutions in Texas as they try to, prepare for the new law that's coming into place that bans DEI, and just some of the things that you see about what they're wrestling with and what counts as something they can do versus what counts as something that they can't do. That is harrowing, especially if you're thinking, oh, there's a law behind what I'm talking about, here in the classroom, perhaps. I mean, if it focuses on things outside the classroom, right? The DEI bureaucracies, I think that's much more defensible, and that's something that, whether it's done by the institutions themselves or by boards of trustees or by legislators, that's something that needs to be tackled. But you want to protect the classroom. At the same time, I think a lot of the faculty are part of the problem. And a lot of faculty who are concerned about academic freedom, they'll focus on shared governance, faculty autonomy. We can reform these institutions from the inside, and I'm not convinced that that's the case. If you look at, for instance, how universities responded to the recent Supreme Court case on affirmative action, the response was almost univocally a political reaction against it. Right now, that's administrators, but a lot of faculty, take that view as well, as do students. So if the institutions are dominated by people who take one view of controversial political issues, how can you expect them to then reform themselves and open themselves up to more robust debate?
Yeah, I guess this is a perfect progression from reasonable to burn it all down.
But I want to say that is a view. I get it. I understand it. This is why I wrestle with it.
Anyway, first, just a point of narrow agreement. I think both of you alluded to the attempts to reform tenure in the Texas system. I think those were extremely counterproductive and misunderstood the depth of the institutional alignment of the left, which is kind of unforgivable considering, the right has been calling out the institutional leftist shift of universities since got a man at Yale 70 years ago and has done virtually nothing about it. But yeah, I think that some of those specific Texas tenure reforms were not just, sort of overreach, but I actually wouldn't call them overreach. I just think they were ineffective and actually to some extent counterproductive, to the extent that you should understand that tenure is more likely going to be protecting the islands, right, at this point, who are under attack by their own administration. They're more likely to be on the right than on the left. But in terms of the larger question, I think you have to go back to what's the purpose of public investment in higher education, right? We have a public model, right, in universities, but we also have enormous federal investment in the form of grants and, trillions of dollars in student loans. So what's the point of that investment? And I could see two different answers being given. One is sort of the college and career track answer, which is, these universities raise the GDP, people are better prepared to make money and pay back into the public fisc, right? That's one answer. To some extent, that's still true, but to the extent it's true, it's slowing down. We're seeing the lifetime difference in earnings start to really level out. So even though somebody with a college degree still makes much more over the course of a lifetime than someone without it, there's no longer the kind of value add, and in part because the cost has gotten so ridiculously out of control for a variety of reasons we can talk about, the value proposition is not what it was in 1983 of going to college. So that's one track. I'm not a spreadsheets only person. There is value to higher education that is not measured in dollars and cents, and I think it boils down to basically you are going to be a wiser citizen. Well, that's now laughable. So on both of those bases of public investment, I would say university sector as a whole, it has been a net negative on the United States, and in fact, this sounds like a radical position, but it isn't. It's now the majority opinion in polling. Starting about 2018, you see Republican trust in the university sector and answering a question as loaded as, do you think the university system is a positive, is value add to the country? Right? You see those numbers falling off a cliff from Republicans, independents following Republicans, to the point where in 2018 you have a tipping point where the majority of Americans do not believe that universities are a net positive for the country. Okay, so this might sound radical, but it isn't. It's firmly within the mainstream of American political thought at this point. So then the question is what to do, and the question, I guess, is, yes, I in some sense appreciate the idea of academic freedom, although it was, as mentioned, already under attack in, the part of the major point of God and Man at Yale is that academic freedom is not without its limits, that there is a purpose, or there ought to be a purpose to a university, that purpose is inherently non-neutral and requires adherence to certain agreed upon principles, even if there's some amount of tolerance for dissent, right? So, I think that what they've done in Florida is fantastic. The question is not whether there will be a content to the purpose of the university, but who gets to decide what that content is. And in the case of public universities, I think it's much better to have it legitimated through the democratic process than by what has been the case up till now, which is a publicly funded institution with no public oversight, and in fact, where the institution is actively spitting in the faces consistently of the people who are literally paying their salaries. So while in an ideal world, I would like to see some cushion. I don't want the governor's office to directly, write the class list every semester. I think some room for a general direction and a statement of principles, and actually, I think that's called democracy, folks.
Yes, so in a second, I'm going to open it up, think of your questions, but I think right now we're hitting on exactly that. We've always believed that some things should be protected from democracy, right? Like the Bill of Rights is saying these things are beyond the reach of democracy. A state university, or the private sector, and we haven't talked about private colleges yet, but the private sector, we think generally should be protected from democracy. I mean, we meaning conservatives. But that gets to my other point. At some point, you have to be ideological even when you're laying out the neutral principles. Because if what you believe in is freedom, if you believe that there's a debate over some stuff, that's what's up for debate. If you say, I object to gender ideology, somebody will say, you are questioning my right to live. And then they're saying there is no debate. So that seems like an impossibly fine, not a very difficult line to walk. At what point, if you were in the Secretary of Education for a state, do you say, this is what I actually believe in, and we're going to enforce this on the state, such as free and open debate, certain things. And at what point are you just advancing your own ideology? Maybe it has to do with, I'll ban DEI from the administrators, but not from the lecture hall. Is there enough common ground to say these are going to be the principles of a state university that can make people happy? Or no matter what, if you push back on the left, is there just going to be a conflagration? Do you see hope? Do you see an example of somebody who's done it right? Or I think you might have been citing, or you pointed me to an article citing Cornell, where they're trying to, University of Chicago.
Well, I wouldn't point to Cornell as an institution that's doing it right.
No,
Quite the opposite. I mean, there are institutions. I mean, obviously Chicago is one that people point to. Recently, the University of Wyoming, actually, their president set up a presidential task force that came forward with a whole bunch of recommendations on free expression that look quite good, and they're in the process of considering those now. I hope he'll adopt those. But I think you raise an interesting point, which is that even things like free speech and academic freedom are themselves political accomplishments. We can't just exempt ourselves from engaging in politics, and expect the kinds of institutions that we want to sort of magically arise. And I think this speaks to what Inez was talking about. I think ultimately I want even public universities to be a little bit more removed from the democratic process. Certainly every 4 years swinging back and forth or anything like that. They certainly should be responsive to what the needs of the community are and the reasons that they were set up in the first place. And I completely agree that many, if not all of our institutions have strayed from that, and they're not, like I said earlier, going to probably correct themselves on their own. But I think that we do want, like I said, academic institutions that serve the people in the state, in the country, but do so in a way that's, a little bit elevated above politics. Now, that's going to take politics to accomplish. And so when you look at what's happening in places like Florida and Texas, other places like Ohio, while there are certainly legitimate concerns about, how some of these things will play out, I think we also have to recognize that, the situation was very bad and perhaps required some radical action. And legislative involvement in principle is not objectionable. Look at New College of Florida, setting up the board the way they did. I don't think that was in principle objectionable. A lot of people focus, for instance, on Chris Rufo, but if you look at other appointees, Ryan Anderson, Mark Bauerlein, right, Charles Kessler, right? And I'm not throwing shade at Chris Rufo either, just to be very clear. I think it's totally fine to appoint him to the board as well. I think we have to sort of wait and see how it plays out. It's very early in the process. They've obviously had some issues. There's issues about, dorms and, all these things that people are pointing to, but it's very early in the process of trying to transform an institution. They've announced, for instance, that they are now going to have all their students do a close reading of the Odyssey in their first year. I think that's fantastic. I think that's the kind of thing that every college and university in America should be doing. And if it requires legislative action to get administrators and faculty to start doing that kind of thing, then I lose sympathy for them, when these things happen to their institutions, because they haven't exercised proper responsibility for the trust that's been given to them as the leaders of our institutions of higher education.
Were I a state legislator, I would require them to read the Iliad before they read the
Okay,
Odyssey.
sure, yeah. I mean, I'd much rather be having that debate.
Final comments before we throw it open?
Yeah, I guess just 3 short points, or hopefully short points. One, on your point about carving out certain things from democracy. It's not that I disagree with the founders when they saw the dangers of mob rule and unmediated democracy. It's that I think we don't live in a particular age in our history of this country where that's the primary problem. I think our primary problem right now is too little democracy and not enough of it, by which I mean that 90% of the decisions of this country, including most of the decisions that we're talking about in higher ed, are made, 1, by unelected courts, properly unelected, right, in our system, for the most part, and 2, by improperly unelected bureaucrats. And so many of the decisions have been taken out of legitimate exercise of democratic control, especially on the state level, that actually I think this is a muscle that atrophies in the body politic, right? And I think we see this now. I think it's a very healthy debate we're having about abortion right now, by the way. A debate that was taken away from us as people, sequestered wrongly from it. But what we're seeing is people don't know how to live alongside people with very different views than them, because all of those questions, those essential moral questions, what is the purpose of the university, have been decided in unelected boardrooms. And I think that that's generally very unhealthy for our politics. So in that sense, it's not that I sort of abstractly don't agree with some of the warnings about untrammeled democracy. It's just I don't see that problem in front of us today. I see kind of the opposite one. And 2, just to introduce another sort of wrinkle into this, we've been talking about internal resistance to reform within universities. There is a huge component of this that is actually external and regarding our civil rights law, right? So here I'm thinking, for the easiest example is Title IX offices, right? And of course these are enthusiastically enforced, the sort of, let's call it the Obama-Biden ideas about due process, not to mention the current things that are under review about the definition of sex and so on. Of course they will find enthusiastic enforcers in the universities because of their political environment. That being said, there are still demands being made from the federal government on the basis of civil rights law to universities, and universities are happy to seize upon those as excuses to do what largely they want to do anyway. And here I'd like to introduce, you've heard of the Benedict option, let's call it the Hillsdale option, right, which is withdrawing from all of those demands by refusing federal money. That's obviously not going to be something that most universities can do, seeing as they're completely dependent on Title IV funds. So that's not going to happen, but I want to put it on the table as an alternative when we're talking about models. And then the third is a sort of pull-out point again about, similar to the first one I made about, sort of what are the dangers of where we're at right now. As a kind of a good conservative, I think there are always different situations might call for different dangers. You always want to exercise prudence and thinking about what the most pressing ones in front of you at any given time are. I think more broadly, the danger lies in moderation now, because there's such a pressure built up on the right. And here I think Chris Rufo is actually, he's the deliverer of white pills to the right, because there's such enormous pressure built up from the fact that the all institutions, but in this context, universities, have swung so far to the left. People feel very, very pushed against the wall. And in many ways, I see our situation not exactly analogous, but let's say with some of disturbing parallels to Spain before its civil war, right, where you have an ineffectual right, a sort of ineffectual centrist right that cannot deliver on the most basic promises of protecting the people who are voting for them. You see that moderate right drop out, and you see essentially a red Caesar rise. I think we're not that far from that kind of politics. I don't know exactly how it's going to play out. But to that extent, I think actually Chris Ruffo's and the things that are being done in Florida are one of the most moderating forces in the country today, because it delivers on goals to the right that they find, they find that the current situation so untenable that if there's not some measurable progress that is being able to, like, when you can point to, okay, like, we are no longer paying some of these crazy people spitting in your faces all day, I think that will actually have a paradoxically calming effect on our politics, where we might actually be able to return to some kind of detente, for example, over academic freedom. But it won't happen until the current excesses are legislatively, I think it's going to have to be legislatively, maybe, there's some hope of doing it without that, but legislatively wiped away.
Final.
Yeah, so I've been thinking a lot about everything and all the comments here, of course, and one of the things I'd like to tell my students is we have to consider history. I actually teach more history now than politics, and that's because, as many of us know, traditional history is not being taught. There was a big piece the other day calling for a renaissance, if you will, of teaching just history, which is why I certainly agree that the Odyssey is a great book to be doing, although I also agree that we need the Iliad in there too. And I'm very grateful. I studied classics. I try to tell folks classics is not some old anachronistic thing. It's a 3,000-year dialogue and conversation about what is so many things, from what is the just, what is the right, what is humanity, and so on. So considering we need to look at history, people like Kimberly Crenshaw and others, their work didn't just pop overnight. This is something that's taken 2 to 3 decades, and the pushback against it now has only been a handful of years. So my optimism, I always try to be optimistic. I think that's what you have to do when you have a bunch of kids, is what we all do, running around, and that is consider the fact that we have a number of approaches going on in the space right now, and we'll see what happens. If Florida ends up being the right move, then let's all get behind it. That being said, I'm going to be a little less moderate, and thanks to hearing everything. And one thing I would add, because thank you for helping me crystallize some ideas here, is that and this will probably be next week's column, the colleges are public goods, simple as that, and they are. And I think back to, I went out to Stanford, and I think about what the mission of Stanford was, and I think about what the mission of land grant schools, sea grant schools, space grant schools we have as well. And, I think legislatures, and by extension the people of the state, need to ask, what are you doing to fulfill the needs of the state? Are you achieving those goals? Presidents and trustees need to be able to ensure that. And if they're not, they need to be redressed. Now, I don't know the level of intimacy they need to have with hiring and firing, but I'll think this through, of course. But states, and therefore trustees, need to be asked, are programs X, Y, and Z helping us fulfill those needs and those goals? Obviously, this differs for private institutions. If my own Sarah Lawrence wants to teach students how to do sword fighting all day, which, by the way, they do, and students want to pay $15,000 a course to do that, that's their choice. But the State University of New York may ask, do we need to be expending state funds for that? Maybe we do, maybe we don't, if it contributes to arts and theater and whatever. But that's a debate we can have, and a fun one that we could have. But no, I think the time is right to ask these questions, to say, are you fulfilling a compelling state interest? Are you meeting it, or is this too extreme? And again, what's really exciting is that we're in a moment where we're trying to figure that out. Let's see if what's going on in Florida is the right thing to do. Let's see if North Carolina is doing enough, or Texas is doing enough. And we have to just remember, we are in the second or third inning, if you will, here. There are quite a few additional innings to be played. So I'll take a sort of an optimistic approach and try to balance that out.
I'm saying history would be a lot different if the schools in Troy had focused more on sword fighting. They would have been able to fight off the Greeks. Questions, comments, and I guess I'll just repeat them so that the TV can hear. Yes.
It's interesting to me that it wasn't mentioned, and also that tells you just how important this particular constituency is. But trustees, we mentioned it sort of in passing, but there's 2 other stakeholder groups that don't necessarily get as much attention in this. One is trustees, and I'd love to hear you talk about how you get to trustees. How do you get them to start paying attention to this and actually acting on this and thinking it's valuable? And number 2, alumni. There's a growing movement out there, if you've all heard of it, an alumni movement that are starting to really focus on freedom of expression on campus, and we need to grow that movement. So if you could talk about that. And also, Carol Lubin was just on a podcast, and she said, and I know she's just joined your wonderful, illustrious team over here, and has left Harvard, or mostly left Harvard, and she point-blank said that a lot of faculty don't believe in academic freedom, which I thought was a non-standing statement. Now, maybe that's just Harvard, because Harvard's so special. But that is, I thought that was a really eye-popping statement for her to make. And I'm sorry she left, because
Yeah.
people are leaving, and that's what we don't want, is the people who are brave and courageous to leave, leave academia to its current situation. But if you could speak to alumni and trustees.
Speak to alumni and trustees.
Sure, yeah. Yeah, so a number of alumni at various schools have created chapters of this Alumni Free Speech Alliance, and that's wonderful to see that alumni are sort of speaking up about these issues and wanting to see their institutions reform. And of course, institutions tend to value what their alumni think, and they want their money. Do they also want their input, right? Do they want their ideas? But I think it's great if alumni step up and they say, look, we love this institution. We want it to be, the best version of itself. And, maybe if, you don't fix a couple of things, maybe we, hold back the money for a little while. There's things like that alumni can certainly do. And they can just be involved generally. Take the MIT Free Speech Alliance. They held a great debate on DEI last year on MIT's campus. They just recently had a conference. So they themselves can actually organize events on their campuses and get the conversation going, that sort of thing. And yes, trustees, of course, play an important role. If you look at the history of the principles of academic freedom, they're sort of articulated against trustees and against legislators, right? The concern is that these constituencies will interfere with academic freedom, and certainly that is a potential problem. But another potential problem is that trustees won't take their responsibility seriously, that they actually have a fiduciary responsibility to ensure that these institutions carry out their missions properly. And a lot of trustees, I think, this is a volunteer position. They put in just a few hours. They come to meetings 3 or 4 times a year, and they more or less rubber stamp big piles of documents that are given to them. But we see great examples of trustees who take an active interest in the governance of their institutions and can affect real change. I mean, one of the current best examples is the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill, where the trustees have implemented all sorts of changes and responded to the recent Supreme Court case on affirmative action in a much better way than Harvard did, right? Whereas Harvard suggested that they might try to do anything they can to continue doing what they were doing without violating the law. UNC basically said, okay, we'll take the L here, and we're going to reform our policies so that we can be better in the future. So yeah, and again, I do think that in an ideal world, it's better if the institutions reform themselves, and that includes the trustees. They're part of the institution, and so they should certainly do that. But of course, the caveat being that I don't expect that a lot of institutions are going to do that.
All right.
Well, full disclosure, I'm from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni.
I was gonna ask if anyone from ACTA was in the room.
Yeah.
Okay.
I wanted to bring up that, I see a lot of hope in the students. I know we were talking about fragility and all of this, and one of the programs that ACTA is running is our College Debates and Discourse program. And it is where we work in partnership with Bridge USA and River Angels. And one of the things it does is bring, the students pick very controversial topics and have, it's all about civil discourse, about things that you disagree on. And the students are hungry for it. I mean, we can't keep up with the demand, and the faculty want it too. And now it's even expanding into freshman orientation programs about how to have civil discussions and have a multiple viewpoints. So I'm wondering if you see any hope in the students, because I really think that's where we can turn in many ways.
I do. So with alumni, just to back up for 1 second, I'm part of the Harvard Alumni for Free Speech. We were all at a big meeting at MIT a little bit over a week ago. And we had a meeting with the new president of Harvard. She listened. Now, who knows if President Gay is going to act on that? It's hard to say. But since launching, fundraising has been relatively easy, which tells you something. There's been unending interest on the part of Harvard alumni to do this. This is, we're going to grow, but it has not been hard to grow. And that tells you there's a need and a desire there. And Harvard and a lot of the private schools, I can say, value the communities. There is a Harvard community. They say you may graduate from Harvard, but you, of course, leave your heart in Harvard Yard. And a lot of folks deeply care about these institutions. So I'm optimistic. But again, we have to situate this in the longer sort of arc and say, this is all nascent. This is all stuff that's been only a year or two in existence, but it's working. There are close to 30 alumni free speech groups all working together, and I presume there will be a lot more. As for students, they're incredibly hungry for this, and they love it, and they respond well to it. Some of my favorite things now is to see them push back at other schools. I gave a talk at Yale a little while ago, and some of the students clearly took it to heart because I got a whole host of emails from faculty, administrators, and students themselves who turned around and started pushing administrators on campus, and they were angry at me, and they let me know it. The students were happy to do it. We're happy to do it, and I was very proud of them. And we all went out for pizza when I trained back up to say, hey. So I guess my point is to say that this is all real. There is pushback, but again, this is going to be slow. This is not going to be a few easy strokes of a pen. Yes, we can try to do this legislatively, and I think there's a move there. But I can't stress this enough. I watched the DEI movement grow. I watched it change at Stanford. I could see it. As a social scientist, it was my job to look at institutions and organizational shifts, and you could watch it. And it didn't occur in 2 years. It occurred over 20. I'm not saying we have 20 years to push this back, but again, the optimism comes from the fact that there are a significant number of people who dislike this sort of stuff. Faculty, there are some who thumb their noses at it and say we don't want that, and it's a club, and that's definitely the case. My fear, by the way, so that's actually where I'm most concerned with the pushback, because the pipeline for new faculty has been corrupted. There's almost no space or room for conservative faculty. I was very much alone and isolated when I was a graduate student at Harvard. I was not a political theorist, so I didn't have the Harvey Mansfield crew to hang out with. So not being part of the Harvey Mansfield crew, and he just retired, you go, what do I do? So that's actually my big concern. I think students are mobile, or they're movable. I think trustees are definitely movable. There's the legislative option. But I worry that when you have faculty faculty everywhere, who's basically
North and South.
North and South. Who, well, we have to be careful there. But anyway, when we see so many faculty members now seeing themselves as scholar activists or activist scholars, and at UVA, there's been a big push to no longer care, for instance, about actual scholarly output. If you helped mobilize a group, if you wrote a series of public articles that weren't necessarily vetted, and by the way, public-facing articles are great, thank you to the Examiner for running mine, but it doesn't mean necessarily that they're all of the same quality. That counts toward tenure now at places like UVA. That's very, very scary. So to pivot just a little bit as I'm talking, because this is, of course, stream of consciousness, I'm now realizing that, my God, the biggest issue here we're going to struggle with is, are there going to be enough faculty that are, especially younger faculty? We've done surveys on this, very much see their jobs of an activist role, and even liberal older faculty are like, what are these younger faculty doing? So that's a concern I have.
So to put a point, like a finer point on this, there's the generational aspect. You said, 20-year timeline. We won't have 20 years, and it's not because of the vicissitudes of sort of the ideological cultural war. It's because of the generational gaps here. So boomers and millennials are going, boomers are running us now, millennials will run us when they're gone. And actually, there's a perfect little encapsulation.
And of course,
I know, and I wish,
totally toast.
I'm the millennial who wants Gen X to
When do we
step
get our
up.
turn?
It's our last.
Oh, I've been writing. We lost it. We haven't had
No, by the way, this was not the typical thing of forgetting Gen X, actually. No, so to the extent that Gen Z is joining Gen X in some skepticism of boomer millennial hegemony, they still will lose because of the sizes of the generations, right? Millennials will control both the product decisions and the cultural output of the United States when the boomers step aside, whenever that is, probably when they're 98. But I think there was like a perfect step over or moment in that the last couple Super Bowls ago, where you had like Dr. Dre and all that, and so it was like a clear cultural transfer from the 60s to millennial nostalgia for the 90s, right? In any case, so there is a generational issue here. So even if there is some hope in Gen Z, Xers and Gen Z together can't outvote millennials, and their boomer counterparts. Now, I think there's probably a small window, and I don't think it's an accident when we're talking about Florida, when we're talking about some of the people who are the most urgent and thoughtful and serious about solving some of these institutional problems before they get so bad they become unsolvable. It's not an accident that most of those people are Gen X, including DeSantis. We've been talking about I think this is Eric Kaufman's work, but I might be wrong. But Gen X is taking the sharpest conservative voting hook of any generation since we started measuring these things. In other words, they're getting more conservative than boomers were at their age. They're taking a sharp turn. So I think a lot of this is, I think some of the vibe shift we're talking about is a combination of the curiosity from Gen Z and the final defectors from Gen X, Elon Musk, also in this category, right? Where they might have had certain sort of liberal sensibilities for the last few decades, but they were definitely in the camp of, no, like, this is going too far. This is crazy, right? I think there's Barry Weiss in this category, right? I think there's a profile of a person, and it tends to be somebody who's in Gen X. And I'm not saying it's impossible. I'm just saying the numbers, you're playing a stacked deck because those are the smaller generations compared to boomers and millennials. So.
Hey, 2013 when I started working for the Kasich administration in Ohio, one of the first events that I attended with the governor and the lieutenant governor was at a trade school just north of Columbus, funded by Fanuc Robots. Again, it's Midwest context. And it was a large campaign of going around to all the different counties in Ohio saying, don't go to college, go to trade school. If you don't have a clear path for college, don't spend the money, immediately make 60 grand right out of high school. Kids actually bid at that, and now higher education enrollment here, this is just rough numbers, like 12 to 20% down in Ohio. That's a decade later. So my question is, and then I looked up all over the country, down crazy amounts of people in undergrad institutions. And then I looked at my alma mater just for fun, and it's down 43%, so that sucks. But bottom line was, that was a campaign, especially in the Midwest, of saying we don't need, kids with liberal arts degrees that don't service anything. We need welders, and we need people that can do jobs that are going to make us more profitable and build stuff and grow the economy. What is the intersection with that sort of campaign that's happening, and it's still happening, and as you covered it at ALEC, you met a lot of state reps who were kind of pushing this sentiment, especially from the Midwest and beyond there, not on the coast. What is the intersection between that, narrative that's being pushed and effort that's being pushed and the free speech issue? Is this going to contribute to more people not going to undergrad, and therefore we're going to solve the problem on its own, and it's just going to be a bunch of lefty liberal people that are there talking to each other? Is that where we're headed right now?
And as conservatives, I love that idea of more people going to trade school, but I really believe in the liberal arts education. And so how should we react to it? I mean, it's very typical of a conservative politician to badmouth liberal arts majors or literature majors. And that seems short-sighted to me. Reactions?
Yeah, Rubio famously took a dump on my major, philosophy. In the debate.
I'm not bad-mouthing those, by the way. I'm just saying that was the policy.
I think there are two conflicting visions of what the university system is designed to do, which I mentioned at the beginning. I think there are, if not outright contradictions, there are tensions between those two, which is the college and career track, plus, which is, I think, more related to the trade conversation, plus the liberal arts. I think it's sort of a moot point because the university system right now is failing so badly at both. That being said, I think we are coming up on a moment with the student loan bailouts where the proposition, the financial proposition of going to college is being reconsidered. And it's going to go one way or the other, I think, depending on the politics of this. So when you ask, is this going to fade on its own? Not if we bail it out. So I've put forward a proposal, actually, because I think functionally we are going to bail it out even if we don't end up having a student loan forgiveness program. I mean, before the pandemic, something like 47% of these loans were predicted to go into default by 2023. That's before people didn't pay them for 2.5 years and before the pandemic. We have no idea what's going to happen in a few weeks here when people's first student loan payments come due. And we own those loans. 93% of them are now held by the Department of Education. Thanks to Obama, there's not even a Fannie and Freddie buffer zone kind of situation where we bail out the loaners. We are directly holding these loans. So if we do nothing, there will be a type of bailout. That's why the political pressure is building for it. In my view, the best thing, and it's I'm sort of alone in my corner on this. In my view, the best thing that we can do as the right is take all of that energy, have a conversation about what value proposition college actually is, and insist that the university sector actually foot the bill for this, instead of the kids who went to trade school. Because right now, the situation we're going to have is doctors, lawyers, and administrators having their 6-figure loans bailed out by mechanics. I think the just solution here would be to tax the university sector to do it. I realize that the right doesn't like taxes as a general rule, and I realize I'm sitting on a panel with 2 academics, but I think that's going to be an interesting conversation, and it's going to be coming up in the next 2 to 6 weeks. The crap is going to hit the fan on this.
Yeah, that's really interesting. And I think the enrollment issue is a big one. I think, people in higher ed need to recognize how much pressure they're facing from for a variety of reasons, and enrollments is one. And it's, yes, people are reconsidering whether they need to or want to go to college because of the return on investment. For a lot of people who go to, good schools, it's still good, but for other people, it's not so good. And then you get stuck with these student loans, and you're looking at your paycheck, and you're looking at your loan payment that's due, and you're wondering, did I make a mistake here? There was an article recently, I think it was in Town and Country, it was called Duke or Baruch, and it was about even wealthy families who are reconsidering what they're willing to pay for. And one mother said, I'm not going to pay for my son to go to Middlebury to learn how to build bonfires, right? But I think it's interesting to see people reconsidering the value of college in that way. Even people who presumably can afford to send their kids to an expensive elite college if they want to. But then there's also things like the coming enrollment drop that we expect in 2025, 26, right? You look at what just happened at West Virginia University, right? I mean, we can argue about that process, but if I was still in the academy, and I'm out now, but if I was still in the academy, I'd be looking at my school and the enrollments and the finances, and in most cases, I think I'd be extremely worried, and I'd be trying to come up now with a plan to try and live through some leaner years that are coming. And so there's ideological pressures from the right, there's these enrollment pressures, and then there's also these kind of ideological pressures that people are reconsidering the value of college. Like they have different ideas now.
And the demographic issue will be self-reinforcing, I believe. So the baby bust is now they're juniors or sophomores in high school.
Right.
People
And
who are from every year, it's a shrinking number of kids because the millennials forgot to have babies. And then when that happens, what that will do is make it more lucrative to enter the workforce when you're 18 because there'll be a greater old age ratio, and that will apply more pressure to places like Duke and Swarthmore. That's neither an Ivy nor a broad So
that's right.
yeah,
Yeah,
I think we could use more grungy indifference from you excerpts. So
Great. I think
just
I guess 2 more questions. Go.
Just like a very technical follow-up, Inez, I just want to ask you, just going back to about what it means for us to do like a bailout for these student loans. Okay, just because I think like the implications are very important, and you're clearly the expert on it. So the Treasury holds this outstanding debt. Does a bailout mean that they just pass it off to the Fed that writes it off as just like a unrealized asset indefinitely? Or does this mean that the money printer goes brr again and literally cash is covering that outstanding collateral?
I think it probably looks like a series of default settlements where, and it's actually one step worse than what you're referencing, because as of now on the federal budget, those loans are in the black and funding, among other things, Obamacare. And this makes things extremely difficult because every time anything, whether the left or the right starts to do something about the student loan problem, it means it's going to have a massively negative budget score, because right now the CBO is saying, look at all these fantastic loans. When they're in repayment, the federal government is going to bring in X billions of dollars. That money doesn't exist because people can't pay their loans.
That was part of
So it's like a subprime mortgage, basically,
Yes,
but
yes.
funding Obamacare.
This
It was a
this
paid
is the
for
thing,
for
yeah.
Obamacare.
Yes. And it's not just Obamacare, there's a bunch of little projects. I don't have the full list. Lindsay Burke at Heritage has the full list, but so that's the financial situation, and that's why I've come in with this taxing proposal, in part because, one, I don't know exactly what the bailouts look like, to your point. It probably starts with a mass expansion of the conditions for default.
And so that's going to be I mean, we need more economists in there, but that's going to be inflationary almost no matter how they do it. And so now we have the conservative anti-inflation measure of heavy taxes from the Stepman tax.
Yeah, somebody's gonna pay for this because people aren't gonna be able to pay their loans.
All right.
And it is, I do think the right is, at least in the past, has been a little bit out of touch in this, that the proposition, like we've been talking about, the value proposition is massively different, and the credentialing inflation has done enormous damage. So it's sort of, people get a Hobson's choice out of right now, out of high school, right? Which is, one, take on an enormous amount of debt to get oftentimes the same job and salary as your father or grandfather would have gotten without a college degree. And then the other alternative is, because of the fact that we've overproduced people with college degrees comparatively to specific skills that are necessary in various fields, what you have is a lot of, this is the typical barista job, right? A lot of employers using the college credential basically to say that you are minimally competent, that you can show up on time and pass a drug test.
My dad calls it the axe murderer test. You're
Right.
unlikely to be an axe murderer. If
Well,
you're
it turns out that, like, post-Griggs, right, this is where the whole civil rights thing does, like, interact as well. There's a lot of ways you can tell that about someone, but most of them will be declared disparate impact by the EEOC, right? And so I don't know why it is that the EEOC has not decided to look at the disparate impact of college credentialing, because there's definitely one there too, just as there would be with administering a basic test for employment, except the basic test doesn't cost $100,000.
Does anyone else have a question? Yes.
So there's some federal laws that require disclosures to the Federal Department of Education, Clery Act, and also receive Title IV funding. So if state legislatures required their state systems, university systems, to publish like a free expression report, Arizona already does this. It's a well-written report, and I think it, lets people repose some confidence in them that free expression is valued there. Do you think that would have a measurable impact on free expression of universities?
No.
Not a little bit?
No, I mean, it depends on which state it is, right? I hate to be pessimistic here. You can tweak numbers to do whatever you want. You can manipulate surveys to look in a particular way. We here at AEI try very hard never to do that, and are transparent. Hence, we release the data when we can, eventually, and showcase everything. But considering it's just going to be another bureaucratic thing, I worry about that. I think Arizona sees it as a point of pride, and I think you're going to see Texas, Florida, and others see these things as points of pride, so they're going to showcase it and do the best they can. But no, I'm always wary of state-level reports like that. Not trying to be negative here whatsoever. Incidentally, I counsel, by the way, just going back, my students out as often as I can. I have large numbers of students who take on mega loans right now. And I do this at other schools too, because they say, well, what am I doing? I'm not getting the classes I like. Medieval poetry is interesting. And by the way, I actually love the medieval poetry stuff. But that's because I'm in my 40s, have tenure, and need something kind of weird and different and kind of exciting to do, on Friday nights after my kids are asleep. And I love that. But, my students are I've noticed a cognitive shift where it used to be the case that students always seem to think that the loans will just go away somehow. Enough of them, and again, I don't have empirical data, seem to recognize that, yeah, something's coming. Is this really a good thing to be doing? Am I really going to take on, $60,000, $70,000 worth of debt, and I have no productive, useful skills? Yes, there is a value to learning history. There's a value to understanding literature, the human condition, and I will never disparage that. But, if you go too far and sort of too, so siloed, it becomes very dangerous. And I can't tell you how often I'm now having these conversations with students at schools around the country over, are we sure this is a good thing to do? I'm very pro-trade school, and I'm excited actually about seeing colleges and universities shrink. I want to see fewer of them. I'm comfortable that my teaching will be fine, and I'm fine, but many professors are not, and this is kind of necessary. Going back to the point that the markets are going to need to speak, and I think they're going to say that some of this nonsense and excess on the left is too much, and it's not producing enough good, public good, or even private good, and we're going to see them shrink. That and the demographic cliff, it's all coming. Give it 3 to 4 years. Again, we're in the earlier part of that curve, second or third inning.
The demographic cliff is in part due to a reduction in marriage and dating, so some sort of study of poetry could right this ship.
Absolutely, we should do that. We should get a grant and do that.
Just briefly, something very similar was tried and voted down. In the last higher ed reauthorization, right, HEA reauthorization, there was an attempt to append an amendment that would only duplicate the obligations that public universities already have under the Constitution and under affirmative federal law to respect the First Amendment, but would have given the then Trump administration the ability to administratively enforce those consequences, which I think might be the only way. One of my sort of disagreements sometimes with folks in the sort of fire space, for example, I'm all behind the cases that they win, great, W's in court. There's a lot of universities, as I'm sure you well know, that would rather settle once every 5 years with the one student who has the money and the gumption to take them all the way to court than deal with their left flank internally. Administrative consequences are more immediate and can hit more directly in the pocketbook in a way that I think the court cases are, don't get me wrong, all in favor. It's good to establish First Amendment law, but I think administrative consequences would be really helpful in actually getting response and compliance from universities. That amendment was voted down by Republican votes.
Final word.
Yeah, I mean, I guess I would just say that, going back to what I was saying before, that, higher ed is in a pretty tough spot. It's going to get worse. I mean, we're already seeing some of the enrollment decline too. There was just a study that just came out that showed that the students who didn't go to college in 2020 because of the pandemic, they're not going now, right? They're not coming back. So it suggests that they've found a high-paying job or some other kind of training that they're in, and they seem to be happy doing that. So we're already seeing some decline because of that, and then this enrollment decline is going to kick in. So I think we're going to have fewer institutions. West Virginia is just one. SUNY at Potsdam just announced that they're planning to close 14 programs. There was a small college, and it didn't get as much play, it's just a small college, but there was a college in West Virginia that I think just went bankrupt. There's another one out in, I think it's North Dakota, that's experiencing a whole bunch of cuts, right? And I think in a lot of ways this is really just the beginning. It's going to accelerate, and we should expect to have fewer colleges and universities, but at the same time we should be working to reform them so that the ones that we do have provide us with a more sort of non-partisan, sort of elevated education that's separated from the political process, even if we need to use the political process to get ourselves there.
Thank you. Please join me in thanking Steve, Sam, and Inez for